I'm going to look at the conclusion of Book 2, the gates of hell in Book 2 of Paradise Lost, before moving on to Book 3, which is supposed to be our agenda today, but I don't want to leave unpassed or without mention the portrait there of the denizens of hell. It's significant for the plot, design, and otherwise. And with it also one of the seminal passages that other writers have used to describe a aesthetic feature of aesthetics in the 18th century, becomes a very significant branch of artistic consideration, something they call the sublime. And the portrait of death is described as sublime by writers from Joseph Addison on through Edmund Burke and so forth. And so if for no other reason than its reception, history, and influence, I would not want to go through a course on Milton and not even talk about that. So if you recall, last time we left off, Milton had described the council in hell with the various demons speaking, giving their counsel on what ought to be done, a war council from within the city of Pandemonium. And it had been decided upon that Satan would go forth from their midst and seek to pervert mankind. And now he's going up through the realm of chaos, which I'll skip over, and come to the gates of hell. And I'm going to pick it up at line 629 here, and I'll read Milton's description. Meanwhile, the adversary of God and man, Satan, with thoughts inflamed of highest design, puts on swift wings and towards the gates of hell explores his solitary flight. Remember, you can almost see an echoing of language. Remember that Milton intended with no middle flight to soar above the Aeonian Mount. He now intends, and there's an element of solitude in this. Satan is a sort of a foil for Milton even here, just in language, not in theme or anything. But sometimes he scours the right-hand coast, sometimes the left, now shaves with level wing the deep, then soars up to the fiery concave, towering high, and then comes one of Milton's grand epic similes. And Milton does a great deal with his epic similes. Here he is making decidedly negative associations, as one might expect of a description of Satan. As when far off at sea, a fleet descried hangs in the clouds by equinoctial winds close sailing from Bengala or the isles of Ternate and Tidor, whence merchants bring their spicy drugs. They on the trading flood through the wide Ethiopian to the Cape ply stemming nightly towards the pole, so seemed far off the flying fiend. So the reference here is to the ships that go from the Indian Ocean down south around the Horn of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and then back up to Europe. Remember, there's no Suez Canal. So they have to, in order to get to India, they have to go all the way down south and so forth. Hence, the discovery of the Americas, they were trying to find a way westward to get to India. And when they landed, they thought they had found it, and therefore called the inhabitants Indians. So it's a very long passage, and with it, he obviously is not just talking about a long, convoluted passage rather than going directly. He's going around here, but also they're carrying spicy drugs, so something like contraband cargo. So he enriches the epic through these sorts of associations. But so seemed far off the flying fiend, at last appear hell bounds, high reaching to the horrid roof, and threefold the gates. Three folds were brass, 3 iron, 3 of adamantine rock. Impenetrable, impaled with circling fire, yet unconsumed. Again, as before when he's talking about light, no light but rather darkness visible, and things burning and so forth, and yet no consumption going on. He is trying to describe something that defies description, really, by using paradoxical language. And we'll see he continues this. Before the gates, because now we get to the important point, before the gates, there sat on either side a formidable shape. The one seemed woman to the waist and fair, but ended foul in many a scaly fold, voluminous and vast. A serpent armed with mortal sting. About her middle, round a cry of hellhounds never ceasing, barked with wide Cerberean mouths full loud, and rung a hideous peal. Yet, when they list, would creep, if aught disturbed their noise, into her womb, and kennel there. Yet there still barked and howled within unseen. So the description here is of a woman, half woman, half serpent. And note that he uses the language of seemed. He's going to repeatedly make clear that there's it's a matter of appearance, not exactly reality. And the associations are decidedly appropriate to hell. They're hellish. Cerberus is the hellhound. And in the references to that follow here, well, let me read on. Far less abhorred than these, vexed Scylla, bathing in the sea that parts Calabria from the hoarse Trinacrian shore off the coast of Sicily, west coast of Italy. Nor uglier follow the night hag. When called in secret, riding through the air, she comes lured with the smell of infant blood, to dance with Lapland witches while the laboring moon eclipses at their charms. Mythology accounts that Circe, who was jealous of the nymph Scylla, changed her lower parts into a whole knot of gaping dogs' heads. And so Milton's again drawing on those horrid associations and populating his own epic with them here. The night hag reference here is probably to Hecate, referred to both in Virgil and also in Homer. Hecate, whose charm Circe used against the Scylla, and Hecate is often in later writing associated with Satan himself. Referred to, for instance, in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Hecate is referred to. So that's the description of the one shape. The other shape, if shape it might be called, that shape had none, distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, or substance might be called. That shadow seemed, for each seemed either. Black it stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart. What seemed his head, the likeness of a kingly crown had on. Satan was now at hand, and from his seat the monster moving onward came as fast with horrid strides. Hell trembled as he strode. The undaunted fiend, what this might be, admired not feared, God and his Son except. Created thing not valued, he nor shunned, and with disdainful look thus first began. So we have the two figures, and when we say figures, they're figures that to some degree defy description, and in particular the second of the two, because he is a shape, if we might call him a shape, that shape had none distinguishable. Well, a shape that has no distinguishable shape, the language or the word shape doesn't really describe. It's a shapeless shape. And note the repeated references to appearance, really to some degree contradicting the reality of what is being depicted. References to seeming. And it stood black, terrible as hell, and what seemed his head the likeness of a kingly crown had on. This is the sublime portrait I was speaking of. It defies description. It's to some degree past our, it goes beyond our visual capacities and transcends them. There's a grandeur about it. This is one of the chief instances of the sublime that Burke will refer to, and Addison does as well. But let's, I'll come back to this, and let me not stop though with the action here, because now we have Satan and this figure, the second figure, who's come towards him with great speed. And Satan then speaks to him. Whence and what art thou, execrable shape, that darest, though grim and terrible, advance thy miscreated front athwart my way to yonder gates? Through them I mean to pass, that be assured, without leave asked of thee. Retire or taste thy folly, and learn by proof, hell-born, not to contend with spirits of heaven. You'll note that when it suits Satan, he will refer to him as a heaven-born spirit. When he wants to flatter himself, he'll need to appeal to something good about himself to exalt himself above, but at the same time says that that hell is his place, and there is that evil is his good. And it's just simply false. Evil isn't his good. It can't be his good, because only good can be his good. But he appeals to this in response to this creature who he has never seen, to whom the goblin, full of wrath, replied, Art thou that traitor angel? Art thou he who first broke peace in heaven and faith, till then unbroken, and in proud rebellious arms drew after him the third part of heaven's sons, conjured against the highest, for which both thou and they, outcast from God, are here condemned to waste eternal days in woe and pain? So in response to Satan's blustering about how he's heaven-born, he gets the reality check that actually you are not all that you're advertising yourself to be. And in response, who am I? And reckons thou thyself with spirits of heaven, hell doomed, and breathes defiance here and scorn where I reign king, and to enrage thee more, thy king and Lord? Back to thy punishment, false fugitive, and to thy speed add wings, lest with a whip of scorpions I pursue thy lingering, or with one stroke of this dart strange horror seize thee, and pangs unfelt before. Both of this in medieval literature will be called flighting. It's the trash talking that happens before the fight. The two heroes are about to clash in an epic way, obviously, but before they do that, they are trying to terrify the other with their language. So spake the grisly terror, and in shape so speaking and so threatening grew tenfold. Now this is interesting. It's his language that makes him bigger than he is. Power of rhetoric. More dreadful and deformed. On the other side, incensed with indignation, Satan stood unterrified, and like a comet burned, that fires the length of Ophiuchus huge in the Arctic sky. And from his horrid hair shakes pestilence and war. Each at the head leveled his deadly aim. Their fatal hands no second stroke intend. And such a frown each cast at the other, epic simile, as when two black clouds with heaven's artillery fraught come rattling on over the Caspian, then stand front to front, hovering a space, till winds the signal blow to join their dark encounter in midair. So frowned the mighty combatants, that hell grew darker at their frown. So matched they stood. For never but once more was either like to meet so great a foe. And now great deeds had been achieved, whereof all hell had rung, had not the snaky sorceress that sat fast by hell gate and kept the fatal key risen, and with hideous outcry rushed between. O Father, what intends thy hand, she cried, against thy only Son? What fury, O Son, possesses thee to bend that mortal dart against thy Father's head? And know'st for whom? For him who sits above and laughs, the while at thee ordained his drudge, to execute whate'er his wrath, which he calls justice, bids, his wrath which one day will destroy ye both. She spake, and at her words the hellish pest forbore. When then these to her, Satan returned. So strange thy outcry and thy words, so strange, thou interposest, that my sudden hand prevented spares to tell thee yet by deeds what it intends. Till first I know of thee, what thing thou art, thus double formed, and why in this infernal vale first met, thou callest me Father, and that phantasm callest my Son. I know thee not, nor ever saw till now sight more detestable than him and thee. To whom thus the portress of Hellgate replied, Hast thou forgot me then, and do I seem now in thine eye so foul, once deemed so fair in heaven, when at the assembly and in sight of all the seraphim with thee combined in bold conspiracy against heaven's King? All on a sudden miserable pain surprise thee, dim thine eyes, and dizzy swum in darkness, while thy head flames thick and fast threw forth, till on the left side, opening wide, likest to thee in shape and countenance bright, then shining, heavenly fair, a goddess armed, out of thy head I sprung. Amazement seized all the host of heaven. Back they recoiled, afraid at first, and called me Sin, and for a sign portentous held me. But familiar grown I pleased, and with attractive graces won the most averse, thee chiefly, who full oft thyself in me, thy perfect image viewing, becamest enamored, and such joy thou tookst with me in secret, that my womb conceived a growing burden. Meanwhile, war arose, and fields were fought in heaven, wherein remained for what could else to our almighty foe clear victory. To our part loss and rout, through all the empyrean, down they fell, driven headlong from the pitch of heaven, down into this deep. And in the general fall I also, at which time this powerful key into my hand was given, with charge to keep these gates forever shut, which none can pass without my opening. Pensive, here I sat alone, but long I sat not, till my womb pregnant by thee, and now excessive grown, prodigious motion felt, and rueful throes. At last this odious offspring, whom thou seest, thine own begotten, breaking violent way, tore through my entrails, that with fear and pain distorted all my nether shape, thus grew to transformed. But he my inbred enemy forth issued, brandishing his fatal dart, made to destroy. I fled and cried out, Death! Hell trembled at the hideous name, and sighed from all her caves, and back resounded, Death! I fled, but he pursued, though more, it seems, inflamed with lust than rage, and swifter far, me overtook his mother all dismayed, and in embraces forcible and foul, engendering with me of that rape, begot these yelling monsters that with ceaseless cry surround me, as thou sawest. Hourly conceived and hourly born, with sorrow infinite for me. For when they list, into the womb that bred them they return, and howl and gnaw my bowels, their repast. Then, bursting forth afresh with conscious terrors, vex me round that rest or intermission none I find. Before mine eyes, in opposition sits grim death, my son and foe, who sets them on, and me his parent would full soon devour for want of other prey, but that he knows his end with mine involved, and knows that I should prove a bitter morsel, and his bane, whenever that shall be. So fate pronounced. But thou, O Father, I forewarn thee, shun his deadly arrow, neither vainly hope to be invulnerable in those bright arms, though tempered heavenly, for that mortal dint, save he who reigns above, none can resist. So now we find that who these two figures are, these two mysterious characters. Milton draws this from one line in Scripture, James chapter 1, verse 15. When desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. He has taken this verse, which it seems that James is speaking about in very abstract terms, and he personifies it. He uses the literary device called personification to create three figures here. Now we have Satan, we have sin, we have death, an infernal trinity of sorts, if you will. Not to be understood as a divine group of characters. Again, let's not confuse our theology and make this out into a parallel on that level, but still there is a sort of an infernal trinity here, and entirely foul in all of its associations. Disgusting, terrifying, and memorable, like few other passages in Milton. There are many memorable passages in Milton, but surely this is amongst them all. And note there the two things about sin's creation. First of all, the birth of Athena from Zeus's head. She comes out armed like a goddess. That he's appealing to classical mythology there from Hesiod. And likewise, the birth of Eve. The birth of Eve comes again from Adam's left side. God puts Adam into a deep sleep and takes a rib from his side. That becomes bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. That's Eve. Here we have it a little bit different because, first of all, God is not involved in this. It's a thought that springs out of Satan's head when he sees what? He sees Messiah exalted. When Messiah ascends, right at the center point of the whole epic, that's what initiates all this action. So as I say, it begins in the middle of things, and this is backtracking to how Satan ended up where he did in the order of events. So on day one, remember, it is that event being told. And sin is recalling that event to Satan. And obviously for the reader, for the first time, we find out where these supernatural actors came from. And she in particular, where does sin come from? And of course, then the characteristic relationship of Satan to sin is described as what? Well, in the terms of narcissism. He sees himself, he sees his own image in her. And furthermore, then shows the consequences of sin in perverse fashion. He has sex with himself in some fashion. So it's not his complementary opposite. It's not a woman. It's himself. And from that perversion comes forth death, who then recapitulates the same sort of thing. But now it's his mother. So it's the sin of incest. All this is horrid and disgusting and entirely appropriate, however, to a portrait of evil that is not just marked by darkness and non-being, but to some degree an absolutely immoral and horrid association. So that's sin. References, as I say, are obvious. Then we get to death, and I already talked about the portrait of death, which I think Tolkien echoes, if you're probably more familiar with, until now at any rate, in his portrait of the Balrog. There's a shadow. There's darkness and shadow, and the shadow is actually more potent than the darkness, because the shadow, there's a sort of a eeriness about it and a lack of substance, which is appropriate to Milton's purpose. But she then is pursued by these monsters that eat her bowels, and when they hear anything, they creep in there, and so she is tormented. There's no rest for sin here. Sin herself is tormented. Note also what she says throughout, and both sin and death say this, and they repeat Milton's message there from the very beginning. Their time is short. They will not survive. They will eventually be destroyed. Messiah himself will destroy them. They seem to know this. This is a funny old thing. We have not yet heard that from God's mouth. We will hear that shortly. But death is so hungry that he would even eat his mother if he could. And he could, but if he did, he himself would be gone. So once sin is destroyed, there will be no more death. Remember, the wages of sin are death. And eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's committing sin, and the consequences of that are death. But if death eats sin, then death is no more, then sin is no more, and therefore death dies with it. So when Christ at the cross bears the consequence of human sin, death is also destroyed, and he demonstrates that by rising from the dead, because sin can't hold him. He isn't a sinner. He bears others' sins, etc. Also, Milton is playing on this in manifold ways here. So having said that, I'll come to the one little final passage here before we go on to book 3. She finished. And the subtle fiend his lore soon learned, now milder, and thus answered smooth. Dear daughter, since thou claimest me for thy sire, and my fair son here shows me the dear pledge of dalliance had with thee in heaven, and joys then sweet, now sad to mention, though dire change. So I think I'm reading in a softer voice. I think that's what he would be doing here. It's not thundering and raging. Oh, okay. I'll try the path of Belial. Though dire change befallen us unforeseen, unthought of, no, I come no enemy, but to set free from out this dark and dismal house of pain both him and thee, and all the heavenly host of spirits that in our just pretenses armed fell with us from on high. From them I go, this uncouth errand soul, and one for all myself expose with lonely steps to tread the unfounded deep, and through the void immense to search with wandering quest a place foretold should be, and by concurring signs ere now created vast and round a place of bliss in the purlieus of heaven, and therein placed a race of upstart creatures to supply perhaps our vacant room, though more removed, lest heaven surcharged with potent multitude might hap to move new broils. Be this or aught than this more secret now designed, I haste to know, and this once known shall soon return, and bring ye to the place where thou and death shall dwell at ease, and up and down unseen wing silently the buxom air, embalmed with odors. There ye shall be fed and filled immeasurably. All things shall be your prey. He ceased, for both seemed highly pleased, and death grinned horrible, a ghastly smile, to hear his famine would be filled, and blessed his maw, destined to that good hour. No less rejoiced his mother bade, and thus bespake her sire, the key of this infernal pit, by due and by command of heaven's all-powerful king, I keep by him forbidden to unlock these adamantine gates. Against all force, death ready stands to interpose his dart, fearless to be overmatched by living might. But what I owe to his commands above, who hates me, and hath hither thrust me down into this gloom of Tartarus profound, to sit in hateful office here confined, inhabitant of heaven, and heavenly born, now she's referring to herself, here in perpetual agony and pain, with terrors and with clamors compassed around of mine own brood that on my bowels feed. Thou art my Father, thou my author, thou my being gavest me. Whom should I obey but thee? Whom follow? Thou wilt bring me soon to that new world of light and bliss, among the gods who live at ease, where I shall reign at thy right hand, voluptuous, as beseems thy daughter and thy darling, without end, and gives him the key. But shall reign at his right hand as the Son reigns at the right hand of the Father. Sin will reign at the right hand of her, and he will be her beloved forever, whatever. She flatters herself. What does he care? So, lots of interpretation going on. You can imagine all sorts of Freudian types of interpretations would be apropos here. But just to show some of the terrific language that Milton uses to describe these infernal creatures that come there, and then he goes up through the regions of hell and enters through that towards the planet Earth, where Adam and Eve reside. That ends the second book. Let me